thank you all for joining me today. And as with my prior mini presentation, I've got lots of information packed into what I'm going to be sharing. So I do have a PowerPoint I'm going to share with you all. And again, you'll get this as a handout as well. However, they're doing that. I was going to actually share a few handouts through the chat box, but it's a little bit of a different, it won't allow me to access my desktop. So I'm going to elaborate on some of the things that I said already, and then happy to take questions as we go along as well. And again, you can just raise your hand, your virtual hand, if you have a question, or you can just unmute and jump in and that sort of thing, or type something in the chat. So, the Allies Change curriculum, again, has really been nurtured by lots and lots of folks. In fact, when I released the book, Becoming Allies, there were about 50 folks that I acknowledge having influenced me, including Alice and Steve, among others, and David Garvin. We're all mentioned in that. So our curriculum draws on traditional anger management from way back in the day, on cognitive behavior therapy. We utilize aspects of the Duluth curriculum. There's DV-specific content, of course, out of the DV field and from Survivor Services. John Gottman's work on couples, I think, has a lot of relevance for what we're doing. DBT. There are a few specific authors whose work you can see in our work. Patricia Evans, in terms of her conceptualization of power, which I think is very strong. Terrence Real, who's written quite well about men and their issues, and then Getting to Yes, and then also some unique original material as well, most of which I won't be talking about today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to elaborate in a little more detail because, I have an hour rather than 15 minutes, a little bit more of the Allies and Change model, and then also go into a little bit more detail, the key components. So it's basically going to be a further unpacking of some of the information that I shared. And again, if this is intriguing you, really want to encourage you to get the book Becoming Allies. All this is elaborated on, obviously, much more extensively and thoroughly. I'll probably mention that book a few more times in the presentation. Or, you're also welcome to do the 4-day training as well, where you'll get exposed to the full curriculum and really get into the nitty-gritty of running groups and that sort of thing. So as I mentioned, we can see 3 drivers of abusive behavior. Typically, most abusive partners can check all 3 boxes. They work against themselves by disconnecting. They work against others by disregarding them, and they work against the relationship by distrusting. And so let me elaborate more. So what do we mean by disconnection from themselves? They're not emotionally aware. They can struggle to name their emotions or even understand that they're having emotions. They may not be very aware of their bodies, that they need to sleep, that they need to eat, that they need to rest. They may not be very aware of their needs in general, a need for solitude, a need to play, a need to relax. And so this lack of self-awareness, which is valuable at times, this is adaptive in certain situations, but in general, it's not so helpful. And so what this means is that they don't realize when they're getting distressed. They don't realize when things are not well. And because they don't realize that, or realize that very easily, they also don't self-soothe. They don't know how to manage it appropriately, if you will. And so they do a poor job of soothing themselves, helping to settle down. They often don't have very good self-compassion. They often don't take very good care of themselves in general. And they aren't appropriately advocating for themselves. Of course, they will very much inappropriately advocate for themselves by being abusive and controlling, but in terms of more appropriately, respectfully speaking up for what they want and need, they don't do that so well. Okay. And so what ends up happening, this is not about trying to control your partner. This is about trying to unload your distress. And so it's about externalizing this out. And so I'm not doing well. And then because I'm not doing well, I become abusive towards my partner or my children. And it doesn't matter how well behaved my partner and my children are. So this is why this doesn't really fit with it always being about control. Because these may be moments when actually my partner is doing exactly what I want her to do, what I've controlled her and manipulated her to do. She's doing it. But because I'm not doing well in that moment, I'm still going to let her have it. That's why it's not about controlling that moment. It's about my own distress. And again, I hear this all the time from survivors, that one of the things that they're always monitoring is what is the level of distress in their abusive partner. And the more distressed their abusive partner is, the more they're on edge because they know what's coming. It's only a matter of time before an abusive outburst happens. Okay. Now, this externalizing of distress, I think, is a driver for other forms of violence as well. Mass shootings are just one example of this. I would say, where you've got almost always male identified people who are deeply unhappy, and they act out their unhappiness by becoming violent towards others. So that's disconnecting from yourself. Now, this lack of self-awareness kind of naturally leads to not being very aware of others. And this is the one that often is not talked at all when we talk about domestic violence. And this is often the one that gets overlooked. And so I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this one. If I'm not very emotionally aware, how am I going to be emotionally aware of others? Compassion is much more difficult if you're not emotionally aware. And then there's this low level of narcissism. Now, when I say narcissism here, I'm talking little n narcissism, not capital N narcissism, not narcissistic abuse, which is a controversial phrase within the field. What we call it at our agency is egotism. Terrence Real in his writings calls it grandiosity. And what we mean by this is just this kind of low level self-absorption, this kind of presumption that the way I see the world is the way the world is, period. That my priorities are the priorities. That my perspective is the one and only perspective. That I am the center of all things. Okay, so that's what we're talking about that egotism and that disregard of others. And so in this case, what the lived experience, if you're with somebody like this, is you often feel invisible. You feel like you don't matter. And this is what we call relational neglect. And this is also what Terrence Real, the language that he talks about this, is relational neglect. So yeah, I saw the comment. I guess B is here, who I know. And here's a tip: if you want to piss B off, start talking to her about narcissistic abuse and what a great idea it is, and how important an issue it is, and you'll get her going real fast. I've learned that about her. So just in case you want to do that, she and I share an equal trouble about that concept. But that's a little bit off topic. So relational neglect, I think, is really the part of domestic violence that does not get enough attention. Although if you talk to survivors, they acknowledge this all the time. So if you live to people who are living this, they are definitely living this, but this rarely gets talked about. Because it typically is not about being overtly abusive. It's not so much what you are doing, but what you're not doing. Okay, relational neglect is about what you're not doing. And a place to kind of get clarity about this is if we think about the way we've progressed around child abuse, that we used to think about child abuse as what you do to a child. You hit a child, you beat a child, you verbally abuse a child. But then, of course, as we started providing support for children, we realized, well, actually, there are a lot of ways you can hurt a child by what you don't do for them. You don't feed them. You don't shelter them. You don't protect them. You neglect them. So now we talk about child abuse and neglect. It's the same idea. It's about relational neglect. And so it's about not being mindful about the other. It's about not thinking about the people around you, not considering how they're different from you. And again, like I said, the lived experience of this is feeling invisible, feeling like you don't have a voice, feeling like you don't matter. Okay. So it's not about walking on eggshells and feeling on edge that way. It's about feeling like you're this little tiny thing in this person's worldview, as opposed to actually having importance. And again, just one kind of final kind of cultural idea behind this. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And this is what this is about. Relational neglect is indifference. Okay. Now, the most common form of relational neglect among abusive partners is their non-acknowledgement of their abuse and control, and their non-acknowledgement of the impact of their abuse and control. So, of course, I think probably all of us, a chunk of the work we do in our groups is raising that awareness, raising awareness of how you're abusive and controlling, and the suffering that causes, and what is how does that suffering manifest? Okay. So instead, of course, we have people who, are abusive partners. Part of what makes the abuse so damaging is the non-acknowledgement of it. Beyond that, there's also just not considering a partner and how they're different, not considering their children and what their children's distinct needs are. It's that kind of stuff is relational neglect. So that's a second driver. And then the final one is disconnecting from relationship, which is the one that really lines up most tightly with our traditional kind of power and control ideas. And basically that there's a distrust of the relationship, that ultimately people who are prone to abuse are quick to see the other as against them, quick to take offense, quick to see the other person as trying to be hurtful, trying to be abusive. They're quick to misperceive hurtful behavior as abusive behavior. Okay. Hurtful behavior is something we all do at times. Hurtful behavior is when we unintentionally cause harm. Okay. We do it on accident. We do it out of ignorance. We do it out of just not being tuned in or being mindful, but it's not done on purpose. Everybody's occasionally hurtful. People who are prone to abuse are very quick to misperceive hurtful behavior in their partner or their children as abusive behavior. Okay, so again, the analogy I talk about is stepping on toes, where if you get your toe stepped on by your partner, there's real pain in your foot. It's not just imagined pain, and it's caused by your partner's foot. However, they're not trying to step on your foot. So hurtful behavior is accidentally stepping on somebody's foot. We all do that at times, especially if we're very close to them, like we're dancing. But people who are prone to abuse misinterpret that and misperceive that as being abusive. And then because she's been abusive to me, because my kids have been abusive to me, now I have to retaliate, or now I have to get them in line. Okay. And then Patricia Evans, still, I think, the strongest book out there for survivors. Even though this book has been around for decades, it's still the best book I've seen. Also mainly based on survivor endorsements, is The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans. And this is kind of power over. And the whole idea is, because you are against me, because you are trying to take advantage, I have to abuse and control you to keep you in line. So that's kind of what drives that one. Okay. And so Patricia Evans calls this power over, or reality one, this idea that there's somebody on top and somebody in the bottom. There's either a winner and there's a loser. There's somebody who's right and somebody who's wrong. So there's an either or kind of view. There's an external focus. Steve Howley was talking about that in the prior presentation while they talk about an internal focus. We talk about the same kind of thing with personal power, but in power over, which is the bad behavior, there's an external focus. There's blame going on. There's an assumption of scarcity, that only one person can be right, only one person can get their needs met, things of that nature. And the idea is to help our group membership from power over to personal power, where there's mutual respect and equality, where there's an inward focus rather than an outward focus, where there's an assumption that there can be many right answers, many winners, and things of that nature. And again, I'm moving through this at light speed, but just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of kind of where the curriculum comes from. So the pro-social, again, is we want to help the group members learn to work with themselves by connecting with themselves, to work with others by regarding them, being mindful of them, and to work with the relationships, their close relationships, by trusting them. Okay. So in terms of connecting with themselves, they need to be more aware of their head, what they're thinking, and what their beliefs are. They need to be more aware of their heart, what they're feeling. They need to be more aware of their body, of their physical states and basic needs. Okay. They need to move from an outward focus to an inward focus. And this doesn't mean becoming selfish. This is about understanding that the only true power they have is over themselves. That ultimately they are not just responsible for their abusive behavior, they're responsible for all their behavior, that they're responsible for their own well-being. To take a stance of loving kindness towards themselves, which is self-compassion, which goes beyond just self-awareness, and then learning how to appropriately self-soothe when they are distressed, to how to manage that, how to, in a general ongoing way, take better care of themselves so they won't become so distressed. And how to be more assertive and appropriately advocate for themselves. Regarding the other, and the others would be others around them, is to be more relational. And being relational means I just don't think, so what do I want? What do I need? What's my plan for today? What do others want? What do others need? Okay. So that's kind of the idea of you get beyond your own little bubble to think about the other people in your household and to be mindful of them as well as yourself. Okay. So that involves, of course, being empathic towards them, compassionate towards them, and to actively consider them as well. So let's say that I'm cold in my house. I think the air conditioning is turned down too low or too high, depending on how you define it. Rather than me just changing it, because there are actually 3 other people living in my house, I would check in with the other people. Hey, is it feeling cold to you? Are you okay if I nudge the temperature up a bit? That's being relational. If I'm not being relational, I just change it because I'm cold or I'm hot. Okay. And then humility is another important part of this, is realizing that you matter, but no more than any other of the billions of human beings on this planet. That you're important and your wants and needs are important, but they're no more important than anybody else's. So that's this idea of humility. I'm one of billions. So I'd matter. And so does everybody else. That's kind of humility, if you will. And then learning to trust the relationship. And one of the very simple things we learned to say is, why don't you assume your partner's on your side? That idea is radical to a lot of our attendees. It's a radical concept. Sometimes it's become unthinkable to them. It's what inspired the name of the agency when I started it back 18 years ago, Allies. Why don't you assume your partner is your ally? Because if she's not your ally, then why are you with her? Okay. And it's about being gracious and showing grace. It's about giving people the benefit of the doubt that are close to you. It's about looking for the win-win and things of that nature. Okay. So I already talked about this slide, the group structure. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more in detail now about this. So the check-in board, again, as one of my major organizing principles, some weeks we may not get past the check-in board. And there is a more tedious way where every single person goes around and reports on their numbers, which I don't think is the best use of group time. So more typically, as I said, what happens is ahead of the group starting online, there's a Google Doc. People have a link to it. They will actually type in their name and their numbers. When we meet in person again, which we'll be doing in a couple months, when they walk into the room, this chart will be up on the whiteboard, and they'll write their name in and fill in their numbers so that when the group starts that night, the board is filled out. And very briefly, I'm going to go through the check-in board, just give you the idea. And again, the more important concept here, I think, is the general idea of the check-in board. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think it's been hugely helpful, especially making us more responsive to the particular needs of the group. But the particular columns are where I think you can show some more creativity or freedom to modify. So typically we ask every week about, have you been abusive in the past week? And we classify abuse into 7 different categories. We ask for how many times they've been controlling in the past week. We have a whole very long list of controlling behaviors. J's for journals, again, which is a primary homework assignment. Are there any journals that they're going to be handing in that week? We ask where they're at in their reading in the book as a way of encouraging them to be reading the book. We ask if they've had any alcohol and drug use in the past week. For our court-involved people, we ask if they've had contact with their partner, because some of our court-involved people have a no contact order in place or a restraining order in place, or otherwise are no longer in the relationship. SC is for self-care. We ask them to rate how good their self-care has been in the past week. We also ask them, as they're walking in the room tonight, how emotionally intense are you feeling on a 10-point scale, where the higher the number, the more strongly you're having an emotional reaction right now in this moment. And then we ask them to list their emotions, a few emotions. And then they can ask for time. And the other thing that isn't shown here is there's a separate column where people can write down their names if they want to share a journal, or if they need group support around a particular issue, or they have a question they want to ask, or what have you. So that's kind of what we use to organize our group. So honestly, we don't really fully know what we're going to do that night until we walk in the room that night and we scan the check-in board. We may have some tentative ideas of what we want to teach, but it really depends on who's there that night, who's asking for time, how many people are asking for time. And this is always related to being non-abusive and non-controlling. So if you were to observe our group, you'd see a group of men, or we have women's groups as well, but for now I'm mainly talking about our men's groups, and they're talking with each other. Very quickly, if the group is being run well, it's obviously an abuse intervention group. It's not a sobriety group, although we may talk a little bit about sobriety. It's not a general support group, although you may hear some supportive statements being made. It's about how to be non-abusive and non-controlling, how to work collaboratively, how to be mindful of other people, how to do this in the real world where, you and your partner have disagreements, where the children are not always cooperative, when you've got other challenges and the world's not cooperating with you. So it's really about how to practice and live this in the real world. And we start off by scanning the check-in board. So typically the way we'll start the group is, okay, folks, anything you want to ask about the check-in board, anything you want to follow up with from earlier weeks? Yeah, hey, Charlie, you've got a life change. What's your life change? Oh, yeah, I did get the promotion. I told you guys I did. It's going to be more work. So, Charlie, when you say it's going to be more work, how much more work? Oh, probably another 10 hours a week. So, how's that going to be for you, man? Well, it's going to be stressful. And honestly, my wife, Karen, is a little worried because, as you know, when I get more overworked, that's also historically when I've been more abusive. So, yeah, we start by talking that he's got a promotion. But what we're going to end up tying into is how does that relate to him being non-abusive and non-controlling? So ultimately, and I'll get back to this in a moment when I talk about the group themes, our group members can bring up anything they want to bring up as long as we tie it back into how to be non-abusive and non-controlling on a day-to-day, ongoing basis. How do you navigate life this way? So that's the check-in board, if you will. I think I'm going to plug along unless there are any questions folks have about that. Again, moving at rocket speed. Okay, these are the types of abuse we ask about. All of them should be pretty obvious to you all, except for perhaps number 7. So let me dwell briefly on that. And different programs divide this pie up differently, right? We've got the power and control wheel out of Duluth, which has their own distinct divisions. And, we all do it a little bit differently. But let me talk briefly about number 7, which is a one that we created. I'm not saying we're the only ones who use it, but that's the one I didn't learn another agency. We came up with as a staff a number of years ago. Collateral abuse refers to people who are affected by your abuse who are not the direct targets of it. Okay? And the most obvious group of people this would apply to are children in the home. So I think this is a really important category. Okay, we know that witnessing abusive behavior, even when you're not the target of it, can be quite hurtful, damaging, especially if you're a juvenile child, especially if the target of it is your parent. Okay, so what we find is that just by adding the category of collateral abuse as something they have to code every week, we get a ton more disclosures of collateral abuse. We really significantly increase the awareness of our group members around who else is witnessing this and how are they being affected by it. So Claire, you're asking about the check-in board. Yeah, so what happens is we expect when they're arriving into the group, whether in person or via Zoom, we expect them to get there before the start of the group. Okay, so if the group starts at 5:30, they should get there before 5:30. And one of the first things they're going to do before they get there is to fill out the check-in board. Again, they walk into the room physically and the check-in board's already up there. Typically, we open our rooms physically up about half an hour before the group starts. So they can walk in 10 minutes before and they're going to go off the whiteboard and fill out their line online. They could actually, even before they join the Zoom room, they can click on the link because we have a dedicated link for each group's check-in board and they're doing that online. They're filling that out. So we don't spend a lot of time. So the idea is as soon as, 7 o'clock, as soon as the group starts, we immediately jump in to asking about the check-in board and what people want to ask about. People may join in late and then they'll fill it out as we're talking, but we try to kind of get going as much as we can right at the start of the group. Okay. Life changes is another kind of category that we came up with that we find is super helpful. It's one of the ones we give the most attention to. And the question is, has there been a significant change or development in your life in the past week or since you were last in group? And another lack of awareness that our group members will have is they won't realize and acknowledge the additional stressors or factors that are present that are causing them more issues. So this could be a change in their living arrangement, in their job status. I gave an example earlier of that, in their financial situation, in their relationship. A lot of changes are relatively minor. Oh yeah, my life changes. My in-laws came to visit. They do this every summer. They're going to be with us for a couple of weeks. So, Chad, how is that for you? Oh, it's kind of mixed. On the one hand, so it doesn't have to be something dramatic. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. But we find that we capture a lot more relevant material by asking this. And this is also one of the most typical columns we'll zero in on, because a lot of times it generates material for discussion in the group that night. All right. So some advantages to the checking in process. It really sets the tone for the group. It's kind of like you're entering the room, and now here we are. It's group time, abuse intervention group time. It helps provide a frame for how we want them to be thinking about their week and their lives. It's a way of monitoring certain important areas, like if they're being abusive, their levels of control, things of that nature. Everybody participates because everybody writes this down, except if you're brand new. So even if people are silent or pretty quiet, we can still see their line for their week. It helps us zero in on who most needs attention that night based on what's going on in their lives right now. And we can track change over time. And there's different ways of doing that that go beyond the time I have to talk about that today. So those are some of the benefits of that. And it's a way of monitoring accountability over time. All right. So that's one big tool that I think really has a huge positive impact on the quality of the work we do. The second really big one are the journals. And again, you'll get a handout. There are multiple handouts for this workshop that you'll get. I'm not sure how you'll get those, but you'll get those somehow. And you'll get actually two handouts related to the journal. One will be this version of it on one page, which is it unfilled out, and then there's an annotated copy, which will explain each of the sections. And again, here's promotion number 3 or 4 for the book. The whole chapter in this book, I think it's chapter 20, explains each section of the journal in detail. So the whole journal is grounded in this book and covers that as well. Okay, so they were attached to your reminder email yesterday. So I guess you all may probably already have them if you signed up for this workshop. So, and again, I can't go through the whole journal right now, but what I would say is just to elaborate a little bit more. And again, I've worked with thousands and thousands and thousands of abusive men. And the journal, because it's 2 pages and it's printed out, if you have blanks for them to write in rather than, with fields to fill in, it can look overwhelming. I mean, it's 2 pages. It's got 24 questions. But here's the thing. In all my years, I would say less than 1% of the group members are not able to fill out journals over time. And this includes group members who've had an 8th grade education, a 6th grade education, group members where English is their second language. It is extremely unusual for somebody to not be able to fill out a journal over time because they hear so many of them. So you aren't just reading it, you're listening to them being shared, because these questions can be answered with incomplete sentences. So what my experience is with illiterate men is they actually can still write some and they can read some. They just don't spell very well. They just, they will write out words phonetically. So this is not a barrier to people with marginal educations, I find. The reading is definitely an issue for some people, but not the journal completion. And basically what this journal covers is encapsulates a lot of what I'm talking about. So if you look at, and again, the focus is not so much on the situation, but on how they dealt with the situation. So if you will, all these first 8, 2 through 8, these are all self-awareness questions. What was going on in your body? What was going on with your behavior? What was going on in your heart? What was going on in your head? These are all self-awareness questions, right? And going on to the next section here. These, and again, you can also do this one where you were not abusive, but going down there is we're helping them increase their awareness of others, right? The fact that you had an agenda here and that you gave yourself permission. What was your belief? And beliefs are different from self-talk. Belief is actually a harder concept to understand. It's more your general worldview. So an example of belief is you cannot trust others. The self-talk is, oh, she's pushing my buttons. She's just trying to go and make me look embarrassed. That's the self-talk is that. The belief is my partner's against me. So the belief is kind of more global. And then we do empathy building, awareness of others. So how was the other person affected by you? And about how about others who were present, who weren't the target of it? And oftentimes, if the person that you were abusive and controlling with is your partner, you've got a history with them. What role does that history play? So we're really wanting them to kind of getting them to practice thinking outside of their own bubble. And then the part of the temptation of abuse and control is it does work in the short run. Oftentimes it works in the short run. It has long-term consequences, but short-term benefits. So we want to kind of highlight that. So what did you gain, and what did you lose? And then continuing on, again, kind of on the back side of the journal, 17 on is more on the pro-social side. So what were you wanting in this situation? But what about the other person? What were they wanting if this was an interaction with another person? What is the thinking that could help you settle? What are the beliefs that would support you not being abusive and controlling? How did you appropriately take care of yourself? And then how did you actually consider the other person? So in a nutshell, this kind of works through and a lot of things to think about in any situation to be non-abusive and non-controlling. So the idea of repetition over time is to make this habitual. Okay. And as I mentioned, typically most weeks we would expect 1 to 2 journals being shared in a group. What happens is the person reads through the entire journal quickly, hopefully in 5 to 10 minutes without a lot of elaboration. And then the group gives input. They ask the person questions, they offer suggestions or perspectives. They talk about what part of it's relevant for them. So we use the journal as an example to highlight different concepts. Okay. All right. Any questions about the journals and that process as a homework assignment? Again, the format of the journals is not sacrosanct. I mean, it's been developed over time, so just like with the check-in board, 30 years ago, when I started doing this work at Men's Resource Center, they already had a version of the journal. Back then, they actually had a much simpler journal, and they also used Duluth control logs, and eventually we blended the two together. And of course, it's continued to evolve a little bit since then. Okay. So some of the benefits of the journal work, which is the main homework we require. It helps ground the material in real life situations. So it's not this abstract, extreme situation stuff. It's personally relevant because they have to write about their own lives and their own situations. It creates a lot of repetition. And the point of all this repetition is to really make these habitual, to really help them develop new habits. They hand the journals in and we review them and give them feedback and give them back the journals. So it's another way of giving them feedback besides the verbal feedback the one person might get who shares a journal in the group that night. Everybody gets feedback on their journals in writing. Okay. Some group members, for various reasons, this is actually partly being trauma informed, are not very comfortable speaking a lot in a group. We can work with that because one of the ways we can still see them doing good work is through the way they write out their journals. So it's a way of kind of monitoring them as well. It encourages them to practice seeing the world through the program's lens. It's also because they work on these journals outside the weekly group. It's at least once a week where they're thinking about the program when they're not in the group. And it's a way of evaluating to what extent they're learning the concepts, the core concepts we're trying to teach. Okay. And then in general, as I've already mentioned, a lot of what we do is discussion about real life situations. And as much as possible, we want the group members to be talking with each other, to be asking each other questions, be offering each other input, to be confronting each other, to be joining with each other, to support each other without colluding, to help hold each other accountable. So we really do what we can to make this as much a discussion and a dialogue versus a lecture. And lots more I could say about that, but I really think that's the way to go. And we want them to talk about, and then some of our expectations over time. So group members will talk about where they're struggling in their lives, where they feel challenged in their lives, where they're succeeding in their lives, and how they're succeeding, how they're effectively navigating difficult situations, and what they're trying to change, and getting better to know themselves, and who they are. Okay. All right. Um, I'll elaborate a little more on the curriculum. As I said, both the group manual, the hard copy looks like this. If you can see my window, and this is getting, looks like your typical kind of group manual, right? It's in a 3-wing binder. So we've got that for group facilitators, and then for our group members, we've got Becoming Allies. This, by the way, will be an audio book, hopefully by the end of the summer. So we're just in the midst of having this put onto an audio book. That will eventually be available for folks who don't want to read or prefer, listening rather than reading. Of course, the obvious way to do this is through formal presentations. And our full curriculum is about a year's worth of material. There's about a year's worth of material in the Allies and Change curriculum. It's really quite extensive. But what I've come to realize more and more, especially probably in the past 10 years or so. So in my 3rd decade of doing this work, what I've really come to realize more is, you know what? A lot of this learning is not happening with the half-hour presentation on controlling behaviors. It's with the week-to-week discussions of controlling behaviors. It's with the little 2-minute explanation of controlling behavior that you hear 10 different times over the time you're there in the group. And the way that I can relate to this is that way back in the day, way back in the late 80s, when I was first getting trained as a budding psychologist, at my internship site, I was working at an outpatient substance abuse program. And I had any real prior training in substance abuse. Well, the main way I learned about substance abuse was not by reading a bunch of books on it or getting a bunch of lectures on it. I was in an intensive outpatient group as a co-facilitator, and I mainly learned from people talking about relapse, talking about sobriety, talking about the challenges of sobriety. A lot of the education was done in these little, one and done kinds of things. Yes, there were some board presentations and some handouts that were given. But I feel like I have a enduring understanding of sobriety that I mainly learned just by being in the group with people actively seeking to be sober. I learned a ton that way. That's what I think is happening in our groups. It's being immersive. It's about the immersion in the group. And this is why I think group is so much superior to individual work. I think they're not even comparable. I don't think people can do good work individually in terms of stopping their abuse and control. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about are the key group themes, or one of the last things I want to talk about is, so this idea is the group members can bring up anything they want to bring up as long as either they or we relate it to working the program. Okay. So that's what we're trying to do. So, and this is exactly what I learned with when I was doing recovery groups for people who were practicing sobriety, is we would meet every week. And this was after I was also involved in an intensive outpatient program. So that went on weekly, like 4 times a week for 6 weeks. And then after they were done with the intensive outpatient, they would continue on for a year with a weekly recovery group or aftercare group or continuing care group. And what that group was about is, so folks, what do you want to bring up this week? Well, yeah, I got something I need to talk about. So, we've got our 4th of July barbecue next week. And, I want to go be with my family, but there's going to be drinking there. And I'm not sure what I should do about that. Maybe I shouldn't go, but my family really wants me to be there. So we'll talk about that. Or somebody else might say, I'm so frustrated with the Blazers right now. They're doing awful. So how can somebody talk about the Blazers, about the Trailblazers? That's a basketball team here in Portland. Well, how does that relate to work in your program? So have you been frustrated lately with the Blazers games? I have been so frustrated. I've been yelling at the TV. Oh, you've been yelling at the TV. Uh-huh. I wish they could hear me too. They'd be a lot better, I bet. Hey, Doug, anybody else hearing you yell at the TV? Oh, I get pretty loud. Hey, Doug, you didn't put up any abuse this week. Oh, no, I wasn't abusive. Well, you said you yell at the TV. How do you think that affects, and you've got 2 kids, right? I think the 4-year-old and the 6-year-old. How do you think they're affected when they hear you yell at the TV? Oh. Well, actually, I don't know this particular time, but I know repeatedly my wife, Susan, has told me that the kids sometimes get really afraid or worried about me. So that'd be collateral abuse, right? Oh, yeah, I guess so. I didn't think about that. So coming to talk about basketball, we related to him working as programmer. In this case, not working it appropriately. Okay. So here are the group themes. And again, another handout that I shared with you kind of unpacks in a little bit more detail what these group themes are. And the idea is anything can be talked about or brought up in the group. Anything is fair game, as long as you in some way tied into at least one of these concepts. Okay. And I don't have time to go through all these concepts, but these are kind of, as a staff, what we identified as kind of the core things that we revisit over and over and over again. Okay. If somebody starts talking about something and they go on for more than a few minutes and it doesn't get related to relevant material, it's off topic and should be shut down. Okay. So anything's fair game as long as it ties into working the program. If it doesn't, we need to interrupt it. That's partly why we keep this as an abuse intervention group rather than drifting into a social group or a general support group. Okay. And so we use kind of these themes to help ground us. Okay. And again, this is not some sacrosanct list of the key group concepts. For your own programs, you could develop a similar kind of list. Hey, these are the 10 concepts in our program that we need to relate anything we talk about to. So again, you can come up with your own personal list of group themes or your own program-specific list. You could use ours, but you don't have to. This is just what we came up with. This would be most important. Okay. So I have a few more final few things to do about, and then I'm going to have actually some decent time for questions, and we can go off in other directions if you want to. So as I already mentioned, our programs are longer term. In Oregon, the state standards in Oregon require a minimum of 32 sessions, but the way they're written, they imply it's okay to go beyond that, and most providers do. It used to be that people were in our programs for 48 sessions, plus 3 monthly follow-up sessions. So I would say that in Oregon, most folks are in programming for 9 to 15 months. And then, as I mentioned, I think that if you're really serious about making real sustained change, it may need to even be longer than that. For many group members, the first 3-ish months, they're in a fair amount of denial. So they're not even really engaged in the group yet. Okay. There's an hour intake to get into the group. Our groups are open-ended groups, which we find works much better than closed groups. And much of our curriculum is evidence-based. I didn't share it with you all, but we've got like a 24-page list of citations that support various concepts that we use. And I'm happy to share that with any of you if you want to email me about that. So again, just in kind of wrapping up this kind of formal presentation, yes, if you want to use the Allies and Change model and curriculum exactly the way it's laid out, you're welcome to. And there are a few people out there that are doing that beyond our own agency. And if you're brand new to this field, I would say in general, if you're brand new, if you've never done this work, I think it's really important that you pick one curriculum, whether it's Duluth or the Family Peace Initiative or Allies and Change or HEAL or whichever one you pick, and just do that one for a while. But I know that many of you all have been doing this work for a while, and I'm not suggesting throw out what you're doing and do this instead. It's more like there may be parts of what we're doing at Allies and Change that you will find valuable. So grab them, bring them in. You don't have to get rid of what you're doing. It's more about enhancing what you're doing, because that's how this curriculum has evolved. It actually started back in the early 80s as a short-term anger management curriculum, which, by the way, so did Duluth. For example, I think so did Alice's curriculum as well. And then we all evolved, and we've continued evolving. Okay. And then again, just a little bit more promo. If this has whet your appetite, I'd be happy to have you join, attend a 4-day training, which goes into all this in more detail. I think another one of the handouts that you were given is a training brochure about our fall training. We offer it twice a year, every fall and spring, on Zoom. So there's that. And then there's contact information for me. And then I can start with a couple of these questions. I think is that it. Okay, so yeah, so let me go back. So let me stop sharing my screen. Let's see here, where is it? All righty. And I've got a couple of questions in the chat that I'll start with. And then I'm happy to field other other questions or comments? So Derek, yeah, what would your focus be if you had 18 weeks and a total of 36 hours? So appreciate that question. And I think all you can do is whet their appetite. I mean, it's in some ways, let me ask you this. Do you all feel like what I've shared with you today, you now know how to run a group? Oh, I've learned everything I need to know in this, hour presentation. That's a little bit what it's like. Okay, you've been doing this your whole life in many ways, at least much of your adult life. But hey, in just 36 hours, in just 18 short weeks, I think the most you can do is you can whet their appetite. I think you can begin to get them, you can raise their awareness, in my opinion. I don't think you can help them make. Could you imagine seeing a therapist who's only had 36 hours of training, or a mechanic? Oh yeah, I read a couple books, so I know how to fix cars, right? I mean, So I think it's more about whetting an appetite, in my opinion. And then Tiffany was asking, how much do they pay? That's a whole nother issue. There are very, very limited subsidies in Oregon. New Mexico is amazing. I'm not just saying this because I'm technically in New Mexico at this conference. I have been so impressed with the way the state is putting their money where their mouth is in terms of stopping domestic violence. I'm envious, honestly. That is not the case in Oregon. So the vast majority of our clients pay out of pocket. And that tension, because many of our participants are court involved, we know the courts are classist and racist. So we have a disproportionate number of working class people and people of color. And so there's this tension between not charging much because our clients don't necessarily have a lot, but we also need to try to make something kind of like a living. So Allies actually is on the higher end of what we charge in the state of Oregon. Our standard fee is $85 a week for the group, but for court-involved people, we automatically kick that down to $50 a week. So practically, court-involved people are paying $50, which is on the high side. I would say these days, probably on the low end in Oregon, would be in the area of 25 to 30 bucks a week. In terms of alternatives, ideas for this payment, we don't do that at Allies, although with our voluntary clients, so the clients that are not court-involved, we have a sliding scale that will go down as low as like $5 a week. So our voluntary clients' money will not be a barrier. And we don't get any subsidies for this. We are just able to squeak out enough money in our groups that we can cover some of our voluntary clients. We're just paying a few bucks, if you will. So we're kind of doing that. But what some other programs will do is they will give people credit for community service. If they go and do documented community service separate from what the probation is requiring, they'll give them credit for that. If somebody's unemployed and they're looking for work, they'll give them some credit for that. So there'll be ways that they will kind of reduce it and that sort of thing. So, but this is an issue. Tiffany, to your question, I think this is a significant issue in terms of money and financing. All right. So I don't know, it's Rema. I mean, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your first name correctly or not. My apologies if I'm not. So we don't have a curriculum for victims or for the women's groups. But since you're bringing that up, let me a couple things about that. One is that a lot of the material that we're covering is relevant for other people in different ways. So survivors often feel validated by a lot of what they're hearing from our program, not because they're doing this stuff, but because the stuff is being done to them. So we get a lot of positive feedback from survivors that way. We do offer a group for survivors, for female identified survivors. Now our women's groups, and I'll just mention this briefly, we are one of the few providers in the country that separates the women that we work with into women who are secondary aggressors and women who actually have patterns of abuse and control. So we have groups for women who are abusive and controlling, who actually have pro-abuse belief systems, and we have a group for women who are secondary aggressors, and they are very different from each other. And that's a pretty provocative area, and what we're doing is pretty cutting edge. Very, very briefly, when we look at the women who have abuse and control issues, and we compare them to men, when we look at, let me clarify, when we look at heterosexual women with abuse and control issues, and we compare them to heterosexual men with abuse and control issues, on the one hand, they are surprisingly similar. They all have a lot of denial. They do a lot of minimizing. They have an external focus. They tend to be very much in the man box. Our women who are abusive and controlling are badasses. You don't want to fuck with them because they're not going to be fucked with. I mean, they are. So there are a lot of similarities. And there is one really striking difference. And this is where I disagree a little bit with Steve Howley. So Steve in his presentation talks about almost all the men they see are trauma survivors. That has not been my experience at my agency. What I would say is a modest majority of the men we see are trauma survivors. There is a subset of the men we work with that do not have any significant histories of childhood trauma. Among the women, on the other hand, upwards of 90%, almost all the women we see with abuse and control issues, virtually all of them have histories of serious trauma as children. So that's one significant difference. And there's a second significant difference, which also makes the book I wrote, which actually does not have pronouns in it. So I wrote this for people of any gender in any kind of a romantic relationship, because I don't use pronouns for this. But here's the other thing that we're observing among the women who have abuse and control issues. In my experience, among men with abuse and control issues, approximately 90-ish% of them have partners who are collaborative. So maybe 1 out of every 10 abusive men has a partner who also struggles some with being disrespectful. So the vast majority of men we're seeing have collaborative partners. Among our women with abuse and control issues, almost all of the women have abusive partners as well. Okay, so these are the two biggest differences we've seen between heterosexual men with abuse and control issues and heterosexual women with abuse and control issues. The women with abuse and control issues, almost all of them are childhood trauma survivors, and almost all of them are also being abused by their partners. Okay, but their abuse is not just in self-defense. They also have other patterns of abuse that go beyond being abused. With their mothers, they've often targeted their children. They've done this in other relationships. They do this with other people. So that's very briefly some differences. All right. So we've got a few minutes left. So Chris is asking, what materials do you recommend for allies evaluation? So, I mean, if you want to understand our program, I think it would be getting the group manual, which is the hard copy sells for $100. And then the Becoming Allies really unpacks it in a lot more detail. Although this is not about the curriculum exactly, but it's like, 95% overlapping. And then you could talk with me beyond that. You could attend the training. What kind of feedback, Claire's asking, what kind of feedback have you gotten from partners of male participants? So the whole issue about feedback from the partners is, I'm assuming you all know this, it's very controversial and it's very complicated. But this is what we see. I want to mention briefly, as I mentioned, we have about 75 voluntary group members who are abusive, men, women, LGBTQ folk, and we have 5 groups that are all voluntary groups for men. So 5 of our men's groups have nothing but voluntary men in it. We also have voluntary men sprinkled throughout our other men's groups. What I would say is that like 80% of the partners of our voluntary people want to be talking with us. They're very invested in what's going on. Go figure that. Among our court-involved people, we have contact with a lot fewer folks, but we're always open to feedback. We're always willing to hear. And I don't know, Claire, if you have a particular, if there's something else behind that question. Partly the reason why this work has to be so long is based on partner feedback. So let me tell you a very common exchange, and this is mainly with voluntary partners. So, hey, Clarice, how's it going? Well, Chris, I want to give you an update. That's why I reached out to you. So John has definitely become less controlling. He's definitely catching himself quicker, blah, 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 blah. But he's still being very financially controlling. We deal with that 3 months, 6 months down the road. Hey, Chris, it's Clarice again. he's getting better with the financial controlling, but he still gets this way. So what we find is there's, the gold standard is when the partners are saying things are solid, things are great, things are so different. And that's typically takes years. Okay. All righty. So I've got
5-minute mark. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. I got 5 minutes. So other questions or comments folks have with all this information I've been throwing at you? Other than can we go? Okay. Well, I've managed to successfully exhaust you. What percentage would you say? Okay, we got one question. What percentage would you say come back to the program? So that's complicated. I don't know if that's really asking about success or effectiveness. And what I would say about all our programs, I will tell you that I have no question in my mind, because I know this, that some of our group members have made significant sustained changes over time. I can say that with complete confidence. I'm absolutely sure of that. I'm equally absolutely sure that some of our group members have completed our program, have changed it very, very little. And like I furthermore say with complete confidence, some of our group members have completed our program and made modest changes or moderate changes. So I believe very strongly in what we're doing. I think it's very solid. I hope that a lot of it may sound familiar with what you all are doing. I think that again, as I observed with when Steve and Alice and Jessica, was it Jessica that was presenting? Was the other person? Yeah, Jessica. I think if you listen, the more you listen to us talk, you'd see a lot of similarities. So I think that what we're doing is solid, and we can always do better. So, all right. Anything else? Last call. All right, then. Well, thank you all for attending this. Thank you for coming for this conference and for all the work that you're doing. Feel free to reach out to me in the future if I can be of further help. Consider getting the book, consider using it as a workbook or as a textbook for your groups. I guess the last thing I'll mention, I keep kind of keeping you longer, is the way we use this. And when I say it's like a textbook, we'll actually assign chapters. So rather than just reading it through, we'll say, hey, you seem to be struggling a lot with financial abuse. Have you read chapter 4 yet in this book? Or, hey, you seem to really be struggling with kind of naming your emotions. You might want to read chapter 16, becoming aware of your emotions. So I will actually tag specific chapters. So rather than requiring the entire book, you could actually assign certain chapters. This is also a way of using this without having to fully embrace the curriculum. So, okay. So now I'll be quiet for good now. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.